Right. Well, thank you for joining me today for this little lunch and learn on bird watching. I created this title with the subtitle called Bird Brains in the Making because, as you'll see with my little intro, the reason for that is I noticed that once I started learning about birds, I just started noticing them everywhere. And so I always joke about myself that I've got a bird brain because I can't help but see them and pay attention to them and notice them when they're really far away, which seems to shock my husband how I notice them. But it's just because you just start paying attention. So hopefully you get to develop a bird brain after this as well, because it's actually really fun. So I've got 5 different topics that I want to look at today. So just looking at why you might want to get into bird watching if you haven't previously considered it. How you would get started if you do want to get into that, if that's a hobby you want to start with, where are the best locations to find birds, other things that you can do if you start this hobby, and then just some ethical considerations as well when it comes to bird watching. Right, so this guy is a black cormorant. I've got them here along the Thames in London. So I photographed him in his mating colors here. Breeding plumage, they call it. So why should you get into it? I mean, it's just really easy to do. So, during the pandemic, actually, this was a hugely popular hobby that started proliferating because people found that it allowed them to get out of nature. They didn't have to worry about germs or anything or viruses. It was just something that they could actually do to get out of the house and not, deal with their cabin fever this way. So really, really easy to do. I mean, you can do it in your backyard, or here in the UK, they call them a garden. As I mentioned, it's accessible. So like I said, because you can do it in your yard, you can do it almost anywhere. It's really accessible for anybody to participate in it. It doesn't have to be expensive, so you can just look around with your naked eye and use an iPhone or a camera phone, which is what a lot of people do. And because of that, obviously, there's no need for a lot of equipment. So even just with some very basic things, you can still enjoy bird watching and spending time in nature. But what I like too is that it's actually really good for your brain. So there's been some recent studies in the past few years to demonstrate that spending time in nature, so in Japanese people call it forest bathing, you might have heard about that, but actually spending time in nature decreases your stress and overall makes you happier. It can also relieve attention fatigue, so that's something we get by being in front of screens all the time. Surprisingly, it sharpens cognition as well, so it actually can help to make you a little bit smarter. And it also makes you kinder. And I've got some articles on the side. So when you get a chance to have the resource page later, you can click on some of the articles to learn more about it. But there's a whole bunch of benefits about spending time in nature, and bird watching is obviously a way that gets you into nature to get all of these great benefits. So lots of positive things to come out of this type of hobby. So how would you get started if you were interested in that? Having a good field guide is really, really helpful. Some people find, so I've got some different ones here that are recommended for Europe. I myself have the RSPB Handbook of British Birds. These are a couple of ones for Europe that I found that were recommended up by sort of birding groups or bird pages that I found for continental Europe. And then there's ones, of course, that are back in Canada, such as Birds of North America. Sometimes regional ones are a little bit more effective because if you're from Ontario or you're going to be birding in Saskatchewan, you might want to find something that focuses on those provinces so that they have more birds from that region versus the North America ones, which tend to have a little bit of info about not as many birds. So having a good field guide is helpful. There's also some optional tools. So binoculars, if you're interested. So there's some specs here given as to what types of binoculars are best. Brands that people typically find. So when I do searches, again, with bird groups, Nikon and Vortex binoculars tend to be the most popular, but you can also, look for different binoculars depending on what you can afford or what you want. And it's recommended that you would try several ones to make sure that the weight and the feel are good for you. Oftentimes, if you go to camera stores or like huntsman stores or places where they might have these types of devices or equipment, people there are really knowledgeable about them. So you can ask those people and they'll make recommendations as well, depending on what you're looking for. And they'll help to make sure that you get the best thing for your needs and your purposes. Same thing with cameras. And so there's now point and shoot cameras that have 50x zoom lenses or more. Mine's a little bit older. I have a Nikon P510, which has a 42x zoom on it. And I still get really stellar shots of it. All the pictures you see today are pretty much taken with that camera. And even though it's 10 years old, it still works fantastic. Nowadays, actually, unfortunately, those equivalent cameras are about $1,000, but I only paid $350 for it back in the day, so I was really lucky. But if you happen to have professional photography aspirations, or you have the knowledge or just that level of interest, you can also get a DSLR camera, and obviously there's a lot more options with those, such as different lens options, which are also obviously good for wildlife photography as well. So you can check different options depending on your needs. And then there's also some apps and websites that are really good. So some of the apps that I use are pictured here. There's BirdNet, which is good for sound. So it's kind of cool. You can download local maps for your region with both the Merlin and the BirdNet. They're all run by the Cornell Institute of Ornithology. And what they allow you to do is with BirdNet, you just open the app, put your phone kind of out in the air if you hear a bird, and it tries to identify it based on sound, and it matches the sound of the bird to a database of sounds of birds that they have, and they try to match it as closely as possible. So we've actually used it now in Pakistan, Canada, and the UK, and it has actually worked fairly well in all regions. So it's not 100%, but it gives you some good options. And then Merlin is another one. So if you see a bird, even if you didn't get a photo, you might have seen it enough to be able to describe what it looks like. You can do a bird ID that way, or you can upload a photo, and it can help to ID birds as well using their extensive database also. And then there's other versions or other apps such as eBird and iNaturalist. So eBird, as you can imagine, is specifically for birds, and iNaturalist, you can upload insects to all kinds of different animals and birds as well. So lots of different apps and websites to help you learn more and to ID the birds that you're seeing. So best locations for birding. This little guy is actually it's a little lady. It's a kestrel that was just across the way on another balcony across from where we live here in London. So there's not a huge number of birds of prey around us, but there are a few. So I didn't want to get the bloodiest one, but she does have a little bit of prey there underneath her claws. So as a result, I say that best locations for birding are anywhere. Depending on the kinds of birds you're looking for, you can really see birds in almost any location. So in your yard, you can obviously use feeders or even grow plants if you have a garden available to grow plants that have seeds or berries that attract birds. And like I said, otherwise you can use bird feeders so you can see them in your yard. Urban settings, so this bird pictured here in the middle was one that I saw at a nearby park here in central London, and he was just hanging out. And rural locations, so that was another place where we had gone to in the UK, but we were just in a very rural setting and walking by a wheat field, and I saw, sadly not the best photo of it, I didn't get his face, but that was a brand new bird for me to see. So anywhere you go, you're going to find them. That's what I love about birding. Reasons why it's easy to do. And what else can you do with your hobby? Right. So you can join a local birding community. So this is what I would recommend. I was sharing with Amanda earlier that that's kind of how I got into birding to begin with. So birding is another way to say bird watching. It's a little shorter to say, so a lot of people use birding now. Was that I had started seeing, initially I wanted to learn a little bit more about my environment, in part from when I was living in Mexico, and I used to see these birds of prey flying around, high in the sky, not really knowing what they were. And I used to ask local people, like people that I knew, like, do you know what bird that is? And they're like, I don't know, we just call them pájaro. Pájaro is the Spanish word for bird. like, that's not helpful. I know it's a bird. Why would you call it bird, right? So you know the name of it. But I realized that if someone were to ask me about a lot of birds back in Edmonton, I probably wouldn't know what they're called either. And so I had this long kind of developing interest in trying to learn more about my environment and be more aware of what's around me. And I did finally learn what that bird was 10 years later in California in a state park, and it was a turkey vulture, which we do have in Canada, as it turns out. But it wasn't until I had bought a house and I started seeing a variety of birds in my yard that I came across a bird that I'd never seen before and posted it to Facebook. And one of my cousins was not only able to identify it, but she said, you know, you might also want to join this bird group. It's a Facebook group called Alberta Birds. And so I joined it, and people, it's just for bird enthusiasts, for bird watchers, birding, for the birding community in Alberta. And you can post photos just to share them, to enjoy them. You can ask for ID help. And through that, I started learning about so many different kinds of birds that I hadn't been aware of. And as a result, as I just going around the same city that I grew up in and lived in for most of my life, I started noticing that there were just tons of birds that I had never really noticed before. Like, I grew up thinking all we had were sparrows and, you know, mallard ducks, Canada geese, you know, crows, what else? You know, gulls, and that's about it. Like, there wasn't a whole lot of variety. That's pretty much what I saw. Magpies. But it turns out that there is just an incredible amount of birds, with different colors, like birds that I would have previously thought were escaped from, you know, someone's bird cage because they were an imported tropical bird. But we have these amazingly colorful birds. And I just, you know, I kept thinking, like, is it because more of these birds exist now than they used to when I was a kid? Or is it just because I'm noticing them more than I used to? And I've realized it's just because I'm actually paying attention, and I'm noticing ditches and trees and listening to the sounds, and just really have become more attentive. And it's all because of that birding community through Facebook that I got involved in. So I would strongly recommend, you can do that even in Europe. I did a bit of research before doing this presentation to find out if there's such things, and there certainly are across Europe. So if you are interested, you could join a local birding community where you are. And I actually had included a list there as well of some of those birding communities in Europe. You can work on your wildlife photography. So sometimes there's contests in different, like different charities will have them, or obviously places like National Geographic or Canadian Geographic, they have photography contests that you can enter. I've included a link to the Cornell Institute as well for their Institute of Ornithology, because they actually offer courses. And so you do have to pay for them. They're not free, but if that's something that you're really interested in and you really want to improve upon, they do offer online photography classes. So that's another way that you can kind of just get more involved in your birding hobby. The other thing you can do is engage in advocacy work. So here in the UK, as I mentioned, there's the RSPB, that's the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. But there's also some international organizations like BirdLife International, specific to birds. There's World Wildlife Federation Fund, and then there's Ducks Unlimited back in Canada. So, and obviously there's many more. It's not an exhaustive list, but if you're interested, you know, I would strongly recommend learning a little bit more about what they do. Even if you end up not, you know, donating or anything like that, sometimes they have some really interesting things to get involved in. I know, like where I'm from in Edmonton, close to us, there is a little town called Tofield, and they have the Beaver Hill Bird Observatory that's located near there. Now, it's a research facility, but they offer an opportunity to volunteer to help with banding. I was going to call it ringing. That's what they call it in the UK, but to help band birds every spring and fall during migration. So you can actually just go out. They offer some online programs and seminars. There's a few other organizations like that in Alberta that will offer these online ones. And I'm sure that across Canada and other places in the world, they would have those as well. So there's just, it's great for learning, especially if you're interested in nature and advocacy. Certainly here, I don't know that there's much I can do about it, but one thing that really surprised me in terms of, you know, engagement and advocacy, I at least want to make people aware of, you know, why they maybe shouldn't be hunting birds of prey. For some reason in the UK, although it is illegal, it's been really difficult for them to enforce. But people will kill birds of prey, hunters, because they eat the game that the hunters like to shoot, like the pheasants and the quails and things like that. So it doesn't seem to matter to them that they're shooting these or killing these birds of prey to extinction, because to them it's more important that they have these game birds for their sporting hobby, which I just find really bizarre. But I think if I were to, remain in the UK, that would definitely be a cause that I would get involved in more, more permanently, because I just find that so strange. But anyway, so there's lots of ways that you can get involved in those types of activities as well. If you really want, you can, as I say, go pro. This is a little example here of a bird hide. So it's a little camouflage thing. I mean, you get them usually from camping or hunting types of stores, because hunters obviously use them as well. But there's people in the birding community who love to use them just to kind of hide themselves. It allows you, especially if you're in marshy areas and things like that, or in the forest, you can kind of just not be seen, and it allows nature to come a little bit more closely to you. So birds do get stressed out by your presence. You would know that obviously when they fly away from you. But if they can't see you, they're more likely to come closer. So you may wish to get a bird hide. I don't have one yet. I haven't gone that pro yet, but it is something that I have considered. So maybe in the future, maybe when we move back to Canada. As I mentioned, talking to your local camera or outdoors shop about the best cameras, lenses, even things like tripods and binoculars for your hobby. My husband recently, he's into photography, so he did get a really high quality tripod that can also be used as a monopod. So I'm really excited about that, to be able to use it for wildlife and for bird photography. But so if you're interested in going that route, you can definitely talk to people. I mean, the person that I bought my current camera from was the manager of a McBain's camera back in Edmonton. And he was really knowledgeable, knew exactly what I was looking for and what I needed. And that camera has served me so well. Like, I think about how long it's lasted and all the cool pictures I've been able to get with it. And it's been more than worth the investment in that camera. So I've got so much enjoyment in being able to take, macro pictures to these, getting birds that I would never normally be able to see with my naked eye, bringing them a little bit closer so that I can learn what they are, I can identify them, learn that they actually exist, and see their colors and all sorts of things. So it's been that was for me a very good conversation with that guy. There's also birding and photography forums on places like Reddit, or as I mentioned, there's Facebook groups that you can join. I know, like, my husband, he uses Reddit quite a bit, and he, there was something that a photo that someone had posted here in London of something, and he actually just commented on it and said, hey, how did what settings did you use? And the guy shared the settings, and people tend to like to share that kind of information. So even just for learning about how to use your camera more effectively, or what settings to use, sometimes those communities can be really handy to get advice for things like that. Obviously, if you live in an acreage or rural setting, you're going to have a lot of, see a lot of nature and wildlife there. You can actually set up trail cams. There's a fellow on that Alberta Bird page that I belong to who has trail cams on, like, he must have like some kind of, I don't know, because I don't know him personally, I don't know exactly his context, but I think he must have some sort of a pond or wetland area close to his property. So he's actually got a little float out in the water, and he's got a trail cam on it. He's got one on an actual trail. And so he's constantly photographing, and they're really high quality photographs of, water birds to pheasants doing their mating dances and all kinds of fascinating things. Like, it's a really, really cool thing, which I certainly, if I lived in that kind of a context, I would get those, because it's just really fascinating, the kinds of things that you can see. People in cities will have them too. You can set up like a little webcam. If you've got a bird feeder at your window, you can obviously set up a webcam and you can just watch the bird activity as well, which is a really nice and safe way to watch them and see all the different things they do and not miss a moment. Yeah, so there's just a list of resources here. So the virtual team will share those with you later. If not the full presentation, certainly a resource page. And it just gives you a variety of different things like podcasts, as I mentioned, courses. So some of the same links that I had in the previous pages are here on the resource page. There's blogs that you can follow, guides to North America, whole variety of different things. So I've tried to include a range of options between, you know, Canada, North America, a little bit of Europe. And obviously, if there's being in the UK, I maybe didn't have the best access to things that might be available in continental Europe just because of the way IP addresses get recognized and things like that. But hopefully you would have a chance to access some of those or do a little bit of research locally to see what's available for you. I thought I would mention some of the Instagrammers that I follow as well, because these are all young people. I mean, I guess there's older people I could follow as well, but I think I'm always really excited when I see what young people do, especially as a teacher by profession. I always think that young people get a bad rap about, you know, millennials or whatever generation they belong to, and how horrible they are. But there are so many amazing kids out there who are doing some really wonderful things. One of them, so I've labeled their nationality by the flag there, but Lauren Gertzman is now older, but when I started following him, he was about 16. A very avid outdoors person and naturalist. You can see him. He's a professional photographer, and I think he's won several photography awards as well through like Canadian and National Geographic and some other international awards. He's really fun to follow. He's just graduated from UBC with his biology degree. So like I said, he's a little older now, but he's looking forward to a career in that. And he just, of course, his photos are fantastic. He'll also post things like you know, other wildlife, sky photos when there's like cool star phenomena or things like that. And he talks about the settings that he uses. So again, a way to learn about, you know, if you're into that level of photography, you can learn from his posts as well. And then the other three here, this is Freya, Izzy, and Indy. They are all UK naturalists, and a lot of them are definitely I guess focused on birds as well, but they do post other types of nature photos as well, insects and whatnot. Freya is one that I just recently started following. I just learned about her, and she does paintings as well. She'll do little drawings and paintings of her wildlife and sells them. And she's, I think, 14 years old. Izzy is now about 15 or 16, and she's very much into, especially birding, but certainly all nature stuff. You'll find her what they call wild swimming, which for us would just be jumping in a lake, but they actually have a term for it here. It's called wild swimming. And she loves to advocate for spending time in nature. Her family actually lives on a dairy farm. And so she has obviously great access to all sorts of different wildlife. But she became known as the youngest ringer in the UK, which means that she bans birds, and even baby birds. She posts photos on Instagram of these tiny baby birds, which suggests to me that their legs must not grow very much. But she bans all kinds of birds, so you can see all these cute little baby birds that she posts all the time. And then Indy was someone who I've actually now seen on TV a couple of times, because here in the UK, one thing I really like about here is, I guess maybe because of the influence of Richard Attenborough, but there's a lot of emphasis on, you know, spending time in nature and exploring nature. Even the other day, I was at a park and I saw this dad with his two little kids walking down the pathway, and they were looking underneath rocks and logs that were lining the pathway, and they were noticing things. And the one kid had a little, you know, actually it wasn't little, it was a huge magnifying glass, and one had a little pail, and they were collecting things, and it was just really beautiful to see. And I think the kids couldn't have been more, I think they were about maybe 3 and 6 years old or something like that. So it was just beautiful. Of course, I became very interested in what they were looking at. So once they left, I looked underneath, and there were frogs and slugs and newts, and it was this fascinating world underneath the rocks and logs. So if you're ever interested in those kinds of things, Europe has some great options for that. But Indy, here, they have this program called Birdwatch, and there's one called Winter Watch and Spring Watch, and they talk to people all across the UK who are naturalists and into wildlife things, and talk about what's going on there. He actually lives in the Sherwood Forest, really the real Sherwood Forest in Nottingham, where what was it, Robin Hood is from, the Sherwood Forest, yeah. And so he actually lives there, and so obviously he gets a lot of wildlife, especially like for owls and birds of prey. So really cool to see someone like that. I think he's actually just started university recently. So really, really cool people to follow. I just learn a lot from them, which is why I enjoy following them as well. So just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about ethics as well. This was a little guy that we saw in Scotland, sorry, in Cornwall. This is a jackdaw here in the UK, member of the crow family. There's a couple things I thought it would just be worth mentioning as, you know, as you're starting out. Sometimes people don't know. I know I've made mistakes. Like there was a bird back in Edmonton where I was like, oh, it's doing some kind of a weird thing. I don't know what it's doing. And it was doing a broken wing dance, trying to distract me as the prey, not realizing, or the predator, not realizing it thought it saw me as a predator, away from the nest where its eggs were. So you know, you make mistakes as when you're beginning, and you know, because you don't know. But I thought if I can, you know, share a couple of things with you. So things like baiting, this is usually done to attract birds of prey. So there are people who will use mice or other sorts of small prey to attract birds of prey just to get a good photograph or just to see them. This is really not a good thing to do because it leads them to be dependent on humans, one, for food, and it can also actually lead them to becoming injured because they may end up hanging out near roads where people are, or tend to be more likely to be not in the middle of the forest where you might get lost. And so as they may fly across highways, this happens a lot in Canada with owls especially, they tend to get hit as roadkill because of things like that. So it's not recommended to bait animals or birds of prey, especially because it can be very dangerous for them. And also nest photos. So being really careful about taking nest photos. It can really stress out parents. They actually, in some cases, can abandon the nest and not return, and those babies will die. It can also attract crowds. So if there's especially if there's a rare type of a bird, or you know, one that's endangered, and you happen to come across a nest and take a photo, it's not necessarily bad for you to quickly take a photo and go away, but it just means that, you know, lots of people may then get attracted to it if they know where it is, and the more people that go around that region, the less likely the parents will want to return to that area. So it's just good to try not to stress out the birds as much as possible, especially during that, you know, like the spring season when they're having babies and trying to nurse their babies and things like that. So, you know, as alternatives, you know, feeding birds in your yard, some people will think, well, you know, if I can't bait a bird of prey, what's the difference between that and feeding birds in my yard? But the thing is, the difference is that many yard birds, they're not considered to be rare or endangered, and they're not really at risk, right? It's not dangerous. It doesn't lead to injuries. Birds will maybe fly into your, you know, sometimes when you have big windows, they see trees reflected off the window, and so they'll think that it's just more trees and they'll fly into those. But that they're not necessarily being attracted to food that way. There's things that you can do to prevent that from happening, but generally speaking, it's not really considered dangerous to birds. As I mentioned a little bit earlier too, like you can also plant bird-friendly plants as an alternative, because sometimes with bird feeders, you have to keep them clean. There are diseases like conjunctivitis that birds can get when, you know, bacteria may grow in those feeders over time if they're not cleaned regularly. So you could try things like growing sunflowers. You know, obviously not here, you're not going to plant berry trees or bushes maybe, but once you're back in Canada, you know, maybe you end up planting a mountain ash tree or something like that, and that will attract birds to your home. And then in terms of nest safety, so as long as, you know, if you've got good binoculars or you're using a longer lens, that will obviously allow you to stay farther away from the nest and still get a good photo. Obviously, as I mentioned, not sharing a nest location with the general public, you know, maybe one friend or something, but as long as you're not making that too public, then it should be okay. And then just only spend the time that you need to get your photo, or just, you know, maybe spend 5 minutes or so looking at it with your binoculars and then move on. So the more time you spend there, obviously the more stressful that can be for the parents. But if you're just taking a few minutes to learn a little bit more, you have a good view of the bird, maybe catch a photo or two and then move on, you should be good to go. So, and that, I mean, that actually brings me to Puffins, because in fact, that was the recommendation. Recently, I went to Scomer Island, and here in the UK, that's a well-known place to see puffins. They've got about 40,000 puffins that hang out there, or 20,000 breeding pairs. It is a huge, huge population of puffins. And one of the things that we learned about them was that they are burrowing birds, which means that they nest in holes in the ground. And between them and there's a few other species of birds that burrow as well. There's a rule there on Skomer Island that you must stick to the path, because by the burrows actually come right up to the path. And so simply by stepping off it, you could be crushing either access to a nest or crushing whatever's inside the burrows. But the other thing is they also recommended that as well, but just spending a few minutes, take your photos and then move on, because it is breeding season. You don't want to be stressing out the animals at that time. So just, 10 minutes, they recommended no more than 10 minutes and then moving on. So just thought I'd add it because I recently took it after I'd created the presentation already, and they're just so adorable. These three little guys stood in line for me almost as if they intended to pose for my photo, and it just turned out so well. But highly recommend you go there if you have a chance. Yeah, so just if there's any questions, you can feel free to ask those. I just thought I'd include a variety of bird photos here. If you have questions about them, you can let me know. But since Amanda's in Spain, though, I will mention that the little yellow bird at the very bottom, in between, the black and white bird there, that is actually a canary, which I saw in the Canary Islands. That these are the original canaries, and the reason why the Canary Islands, you'd think that they would have got their name from the canary birds, but that's actually the opposite. The canary birds were first discovered in the Canary Islands. Canary doesn't actually refer to the bird, it refers to canines in the original etymology. But these original canary birds were eventually bred to become fully yellow and domesticated. But this little one here was actually the original canary bird and what they would look like in nature. I have also included my blog as well. It's called Canuck Birder in London. And I do have a link to my Alberta Birds page there in that link as well. If you check the About Me section, I think I've included my link to Alberta Birds, should you ever be interested to learn about birds that are in that province. And I think that's about all I can think of to say. So if anyone's got any questions, you can feel free to ask.